Hey guys, today's topic is going to be about programming Olympic weightlifting with your athletes that are not Olympic weightlifters. So, if you followed TJ and I for a while, you know that we go back and forth on some topics about Olympic weightlifting as far as it pertains to training collegiate athletes, professional athletes, high school athletes, CrossFitters, and Olympic lifters, gymnasts, and where this Olympic lifting that we'll actually call a separate sport, it is a separate sport, and where these type of lifts actually fit into training programs. So I will say first that I love Olympic lifting. It is super fun. I love really technical lifts. I love clean and jerks. I love snatches. I love performing snatches. Um, this type of lifting is very mentally stimulating. It's very challenging. It's fun to learn. It looks cool when you do it. And on top of that, it is a great way to display power. Now, notice that I said display power. The Olympic lifts, the clean and jerk and the snatch, are very, very technique dependent. Now, unless you're taking it into a full squat clean or a full squat snatch where you have to front squat or overhead squat the weight, the clean and jerk and the power snatch are very, very, very acceleration dependent. And what I mean is you can be extremely fast and extremely weak and still be able to perform a pretty good clean and jerk and a pretty good power snatch. You can also be extremely strong and powerful and very slow and be terrible at these lifts. And that's why they take so much time to teach. Now, there are more cues than you could imagine on these Olympic lifts. On the clean and jerk alone, there's 20 something cues, true cues, where an athlete can be coached and where an athlete can mess up. And this is where some of the problems that I've had in the past that I've talked about with certain CrossFit coaches prescribing these lifts to people that don't know them very well is that they break down these Olympic lifts to like 4 or 5 cues to make it easy. And I understand that. I understand, and Olympic lifting has its big place in CrossFit. But it's not necessarily the safest way to do it, because teaching a lift that is so technical, that has 20 to 25, I think the clean and jerk is actually closer to 27 true coaching cues where an athlete can mess up, and summarizing that to 5 cues for someone that is only going to be doing an Olympic lift once or twice a week as part of a WOD is a very unsafe way to teach these lifts. I think that all CrossFit coaches should also be USAW certified so that they understand how to teach these lifts, because you just can't learn the perfect way to cue all these lifts at a weekend certification course that CrossFit offers. And that does not mean that I'm against CrossFit or Olympic lifting in CrossFit. That means that I think that the coaches should take the initiative to educate themselves before they prescribe these lifts, and that will prevent people from getting hurt. On top of that, if you think that CrossFit coaches are bad at programming Olympic weightlifting, you should see your high school strength and conditioning coaches or your college strength and conditioning coaches. Now, professional strength and conditioning coaches tend to be a little bit better just because they get paid a lot more. But your high school strength and conditioning coaches and your college, especially your lower level D2 and D3 programs, and even your D1 AA programs, their strength and conditioning coaches, I promise, are terrible at learning how to program these lifts. Most of them don't perform the lifts on their own. You could walk into probably 10 strength and conditioning programs across the nation, and I would bet that 3 strength and conditioning coaches properly know how to program the power snatch and the power clean and jerk into their athletic training programs. And that doesn't even take into account the strength and conditioning coaches that know how to program it but don't know how to teach the actual lift properly. I have never seen a high school student do a perfect power clean and jerk or a power snatch out of a high school strength and conditioning program. I have seen them out of high school, professional weightlifting programs such as like MASH Elite or the USAW or Muscle Driver, those guys like that. They do great, but they are not your high school strength and conditioning coaches. Your high school strength and conditioning coaches are dealing with a lot of athletes, and your college ones, they deal with a lot of athletes, and they do not have the time or the resources to watch every single athlete do these lifts multiple times. And the thing about Olympic lifting is it is all about your volume over time. You have to practice these lifts to build the neuromuscular components and make these lifts automatic at certain weights so that you can perform them properly. And that is all beside the point that these lifts are not good at developing power. They are good at displaying power, much like a vertical jump, much like a rotational med ball throw. Great displays of power, but you can't often use those exercises to build power because you get fatigued so easy. You have to train in and around these movements in order to actually develop power. So that's why you see true Olympic coaches, they do a lot of front squats, a lot of back squats, a lot of half reps, a lot of things from mid shin to hip or mid shin to high pull or mid shin to overhead. They break the movement down, and that's where you really develop the power. The great thing about Olympic lifting, and why I think it has taken off with strength and conditioning programs, is building kinesthetic awareness. And if an athlete can take 225 pounds from the floor and bring it straight overhead in a power snatch, they typically know where their body is in position to the area around them and where the weight is in position to their body. And that is the definition of kinesthetic awareness, knowing where you're at in space. And knowing where you're at in space, that kinesthetic awareness is one of the most valuable athletic tools. In order for an athlete, say, a receiver, a football wide receiver, to sprint down the field, spin around and jump at the same time and catch a football, they have to be very kinesthetically aware. If they're not going to know when to turn, where to turn, how to catch, what to do with their hands when they get to that point. And Olympic weightlifting is a good way to prime that kinesthetic awareness. On top of that, like I said, it's a great way to stage your athletes, to know which athletes are most powerful and which ones are strong but not very powerful, which can play a big role in where you place athletes on the field. Again, with football or rugby, some of those guys that are extremely powerful and explosive athletes would be closer at running backs or wide receivers, where the guys that are strong but not necessarily explosive might be more like your blocking fullbacks or your guards and tackles, where they can haul around a lot of weight but don't necessarily have that quick explosive ability or great kinesthetic awareness. Besides that, Olympic lifting does not have any upside besides those two things. So what we tend to program instead is the use of a kettlebell. And the reason that I love the kettlebell is that you can perform all of these Olympic lifts, the clean and jerk, clean, snatch, squat clean, squat snatch, overhead squat, just straight jerk, alternating presses. You can do all of that with kettlebells with appropriate load, because they make kettlebells up to 200 pounds. With appropriate load, you can do all of this, and it is much safer. When you're talking about athletes, let me take one of my training clients, Carlos, for example. Carlos is a professional soccer player. His job is to play soccer. That's what he gets paid to do. If he gets hurt, he doesn't get paid because he can't play. Therefore, programming Olympic lifting with a barbell over his head in a position that he is not necessarily comfortable all the time is very dangerous to his career. Not just his body, but to his career. If he gets injured, he can't pay his bills. When you look at high school athletes that are trying to get scholarships, some of these kids, athletics is their only shot. They don't necessarily have the best grades. They don't come from a family that can pay for college. They don't necessarily have government support. So they're in this bubble of guys that the only way that they're going to pay for their undergraduate degree is to play sports, which comes around to sometimes a multi-million-dollar investment if you look at the long-term, 30-year span of how much money they'll make with a college degree compared to without one. So you're talking about a multi-million-dollar investment, and you're going to summarize an unsafe lift in 5 cues and have them pick it up over their head. If he or she tears a rotator cuff, tears a labrum, injures a knee, their college could go out the window. Professional athletes are the same way. Coming back from ACL injuries, labrum injuries, shoulder injuries, hip injuries, knee injuries, they don't come back quite the same. Most of them don't. And that is, their livelihood. That's how they're making their money. So when you program these lifts, you have to take into consideration, how safe is this for my athlete, and how can I protect their livelihood and their career along with making them stronger, more kinesthetically aware, and more powerful. And that's why I like the kettlebell, because doing an overhead snatch with a kettlebell is much easier to bail out from than doing an overhead snatch with a loaded barbell. You can just dump it to the side. You can literally just throw it and drop it. Compared to a barbell where it could come crashing down and completely transect your spinal cord, and you could be paralyzed for life. Yeah, that could also happen with a kettlebell, but it's not as likely, not near as likely. On top of that, the kettlebells, because of how the center of gravity is, you have to be stronger and more stable to get it up. You have to be more kinesthetically aware. You have to be aware of how the bell moves even when you're bringing it overhead, so that, a 100-pound bell doesn't come smashing down on your wrist. You have to be able to roll it perfectly. On top of that, you can unilaterally load with kettlebells, which any type of unilateral movement is much more beneficial for athletes, because that's how we move in space. We don't move bilaterally, we move unilaterally. When we're running, we run bilaterally, one hand at a time, one leg at a time, one hip at a time. Same with, jumping, sprinting. We may think we do this bilaterally, but we don't. We do this everything unilaterally. By unilateral training, we can pick up imbalances in the athletes. Some athletes will jump with 2 legs, but if you really watch them, they completely load their right leg and put about 20-25% of their weight on their left leg. And that will limit their power development. By training unilaterally, we can identify these weaknesses much easier, and we can train them easier too, along with preventing the injury that could occur with Olympic weightlifting overhead. So doing single arm kettlebell stuff is the way to go, and that's what we program. And if you don't have kettlebells, either get one. Most gyms have them now. Get a small one at your apartment or something and bring it with you. I've seen guys do that. Or you can use a dumbbell. A dumbbell's also a safer way too. I prefer the kettlebell, because your hand placement doesn't necessarily dictate how stable you're going to be, whereas a dumbbell, if you put your hand in the wrong spot, you are going to be activating completely different muscles at completely different angles. That typically doesn't happen with the kettlebell. But yeah, Olympic snatches, clean and presses, alternating presses, push jerks, all of that. Try it with a kettlebell. Try using kettlebells with your athletes and see how they develop differently. Not only is it much easier to coach, it's much safer, and you can supervise more athletes at once. I can put 6 or 7 athletes in a space with a kettlebell in each hand, compared to the same amount of space I could put maybe 2 or 3 athletes with a barbell. with a loaded barbell. So it's easier to supervise, it's an easier movement to learn, it's safer, it's more forgiving with technique faults, and you can load it unilaterally, but you get the same benefits of displays of power and kinesthetic awareness. So if you guys have any questions about this topic, again, this is another topic that I really like to talk about. I could talk for an hour on it, just about how this type of training is not good for your athletes, and that how you should incorporate different modalities such as the kettlebell to compensate for that gap that you need of kinesthetic awareness and power development. Gymnastics is another modality that you can use. But if you guys have any other questions about this topic, just shoot us an email. If you've got a good detailed question, we may make a video on it too. Thanks.